Alaikum. We're going to be continuing our series about the Code Evolved, inshallah. Begin with stage 2. This time is the era of the righteous khulafa. So this period basically began with the death of Muhammad and then ended when Ali radiallahu anhu gave up the khulafa to Muawiyah. So a question that was brought up in class about this time period is, was Islam spread by the sword? That's often like a common criticism of Islam. And so the answer is, well, that's sort of an invalid question, because at the time of at this period of time, that was sort of the natural evolvement of states, is that people would go out and conquer other lands using swords, but Islam was no different than other nations that expanded in this way. But what's really important, I think, during this time, and what is relevant, is that Islam went out and established the moral code of Islam wherever they went, and sort of they made huge impacts on society and changed the way that people sort of lead their lives and lead their societies, and it made a huge positive impact on people in that way. I think that's more important than focusing on the fact that maybe they used a sword. So major events during this period are that, well, first the compilation of the Quran, which was done mostly by Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and then Uthman radiallahu anhu standardized it and distributed it to the Muslim world. The state of Islam was also largely expanded during this time, during the leadership of these khulafa. It was also the time of the first fitna, the first civil war between the Muslims, and led to the assassination of Uthman radiallahu anhu. So the methodology of the sahabah, the companions, were in general very cautious about giving fatwas. They used to refrain from excessive narrations of hadith, and then they were also pretty independent when it came to ijtihad. Characteristics of fiqh during this time period was, one, the absence of factionalism or self-interest. So basically, there was a lot more agreement in general among the Muslim community at that time, and not too many conflicts. Also, another characteristic is that the fiqh was based on realism, and so they would only really answer questions that were relevant to that period of time, to those people, and not really go into dealing with hypotheticals or what if questions as much. It was generally very easy to arrive at ijma', in part because there was an absence of factionalism. The khalifa's decisions at the time were the ones that would lead to the establishment of law. And then prominent fuqaha during the stage were Umar al-Khattab, Zayd bin Thabit, and Abdullah bin Masud. That was a pretty straightforward stage. The next one is the stage 3, the area of the young sahabah and the tabi'in. So this one began, as I alluded to earlier, sort of with the beginning of Muawiyah's rule after Ali succeeded power to him. So unfortunately, a very important sort of characteristic of this stage is that there was a lot of fitna and a lot of factionalism. So Ibn Sirin talked about this period and said that they never asked about isnad until the fitna occurred. So as in people never really asked about the chain of narrators, or they never really asked to try to verify if what somebody was saying was true or not before the stage, because there was so much agreement in general in the community. But in this stage, people actually started questioning other people's statements and would try to verify their statements to make sure that whatever they were relating was actually valid. So this time period was during the Umayyad dynasty, which was a long time period. It was a little bit rocky at first, but then eventually during the time of Marwan ibn Hakam actually reached the golden ages. One of the characteristics of the Umayyads was that they wanted to keep powers in the hands of the Arabs, in particular in the Quraysh hands. There was a large spread of Islam during this time, so it went all the way to Andalus, to Azerbaijan, and nearly to China during the Umayyad Khalifa. So some of the conflicts sort of began with Ali and Muawiyah. They met first in Siffin and had a battle there. Muawiyah apparently was almost about to lose, but then they decided to stop the war preemptively in order to just maintain peace. Unfortunately, some of Ali's supporters were upset about this, and they wanted to establish their victory, and so they split off. They initially formed the Khawarij group, and then they moved to Harura. Eventually, some of these people became Shia, and so that sort of led to the establishment of Shiaism. And meanwhile, after Ali's rule, Hassan took over for him initially, but then because there was so much factionalism and so much conflict, Hassan like gladly stepped down and gave power to Muawiyah just for the sake of peace. Unfortunately, then Muawiyah took over and then he formed a monarchy. So after his rule was over, he established that his son Yazid would take over in his place. Some of the characteristics of this stage was large geographic expansion that I mentioned. There's establishment of new urban areas, so like Kufa and Basra in Iraq were established during this time. And there's also a lot of political turmoil as well that we talked about. So some of the factors that were affecting the fiqh at this time were the general division of the ummah. There's also turbulence in the arena of knowledge because there was so much political conflict. The scholars sort of like dispersed and often went into hiding because a lot of the politicians tried to gain support by aligning themselves with the ulama, and they would often try to like marry into the ulama or otherwise form personal relationships with them. The scholars often didn't like this, and so they instead tried to go into hiding and tried to like avoid this, not wanting to get into the political scene. This time period also marks the establishment of the first madhahib, and so we'll talk about that next. It became a very popular time to narrate hadith. This became more and more common. Unfortunately, it also became more common to fabricate hadith, which is why people started asking more about isnad than about chains of narrators. And then because of the large spread of Islam, a lot of non-Arabs also converted to Islam during this time. So the first two sects in Islam were the Khawarij and the Shia, which we already kind of talked about, coming off of Ali's supporters. And then, so sort of talking about Aqidah and Fiqh, so some people started doubting the credibility of the Sahaba, and this led to a different type of fiqh, which is mostly like the Shia fiqh. And you often, like, if there was a difference between Aqidah and Fiqh, then this would lead to a formation of a new madhab. So the mainstream belief at this time was Ahl Sunnah, and this is what was supported by the state, but there were also different factions that emerged as well. The time period where the first madhahib emerged, I should say. So the two main madhahib were the Hijazi and Iraqi. They were both named on geographical areas. So Hijazi was like from Yemen and Egypt, that kind of region. They were known to be a more Bedouin traditional tribe. They were sort of against philosophical reasoning and debates and more just like literal, more supportive of like literal interpretations of the Quran and Sunnah. So they were less expansive than the Iraqi madhab. They are known to be very loyal to the text. An example is Abdullah bin Umar, who was like so extreme oftentimes to the example of the Prophet ﷺ, that, for example, one time, he was seen to be praying in the Kaaba, like in the exact place where he saw the Prophet ﷺ praying. He was that literal to the example. And they did constitute the majority of the population at that time. So in contrast, there's the Iraqi school. So their philosophy was that all the rulings of Sharia were based on perceivable and identifiable reasons, and they thought the scholar's job was to go after those reasons and understand them. So their methodology was sort of adopted from the Persians, which involved a lot of questioning and a lot of like use of philosophy and reason in their interpretations. So they were centered in Kufa and in Basra. They were often known to ask Ara'aita, which means what if, and so they were nicknamed Ara'aitiyun, the what ifers. And from these two schools, the Hijazi and the Iraqi, emerged the other madhab later on. So that's the conclusion of this short video. Inshallah, we'll be starting with stage 4 next time. Assalamu alaikum.